Surely, you've seen the movie Airplane. But did you know that it is a takeoff of a very specific movie? In fact, it's almost a shot-for-shot parody of a film called 0 Hour from 1957. Well, that's what people say, but is it really true? To find out, I watched 0 Hour, and in this video, I'm going to set the record straight a little bit, and also talk about whether or not there's any point in watching this movie, 0 Hour, just on its own. Given that this channel mainly covers boring and or pretentious movies, you might be surprised that I've even seen Airplane. In fact, I'm a huge fan of the Zucker brothers and Jim Abrahams. Their short-lived television program Police Squad, which also starred Leslie Nielsen, as well as Rex Harrison playing Abraham Lincoln, and was adapted into the film series The Naked Gun. That show is really the epitome of my sense of humor. I realize that might not come across in these deeply serious and analytical videos, but you'll have to take my word for it. That series is actually also a very direct adaptation of another dramatic, serious series. In this case, the original is called M Squad. You may or may not have heard of that. Of course, it's very common for comedies to be based on other things. That's kind of the core idea of a parody. But I think people are often surprised when they see just how direct the Zucker brothers and Jim Abrahams were with their parody, with their adaptation. Maybe we're used to parody happening at the level of a genre. It's also worth noting that for both Police Squad and Airplane, the source material really isn't as well known, especially today. It's considerably older. So I guess it may be particularly surprising to see how specific these parodies are when you've not heard of the source material. Maybe it would be different to pull one or two scenes out of very famous movies. In fact, it's very common for parodies to be takeoffs on something very famous. But it is a bit odd when you discover that this movie you've loved is a takeoff on something you've never heard of. There are a number of videos on this very platform comparing Airplane and Police Squad side by side with their source material, and people tend to be kind of surprised by these videos. Now, I have to admit that when I first saw one of these comparisons, I had somewhat mixed feelings. In some ways, the script seems even more ingenious when you see the source material, when you see how they weave these jokes out of the original. But does it maybe feel also like they're taking a shortcut? Like they're cheating? There are a bunch of straight lines that are lifted directly from the source, and some of the jokes kind of just fall out of the original lines. I don't think it's anything too crazy either way, but I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think about this type of sort of direct adaptation, this direct parody. Of course, part of making up your mind about all this might involve watching 0 Hour, or you could just keep watching this video. I think there's two big questions here. The first one is just how similar are the movies, and the second one is 0 Hour any good? If I was a professional YouTuber, I would probably stall a bit and tell you this precious information only at the very end, but let's just get to the point. First of all, the movies are pretty similar, but I actually think that most reviews overstate exactly how much they have in common. I'll talk about the differences more specifically in a moment. I saw a review that said the movies are 75% the same. I don't think that's true. Obviously, the overall premise of the two movies is the same, and there are some scenes that are very similar, that use basically the same shots and use some of the same lines. These are the scenes that you'll see in these side-by-side comparison videos, and they're pretty jarring. But the vast majority of the movie does not contain scenes like that, does not fall into that category. Most of the scenes are quite different. It also becomes pretty clear that Airplane used a lot of other movies as source material as well, that there's a lot of spoof and parody of other movies, stuff that's not in 0 Hour, and some of these takeoffs are pretty obvious, and some of them have also faded a little bit into obscurity. Airport, I guess, might be one of the more obvious examples. I'll touch on some of the key differences later, I guess. For the second question, which is whether or not this movie is any good, it's pretty good. It's not amazing, and it's definitely a 1950s movie, so I wouldn't really recommend it to everyone, but I'll go more in depth into the pros and cons in a bit. First, let me give you a real introduction to 0 Hour. Like I said, it's from 1957. It was directed by Hall Bartlett. This is actually the second Hall Bartlett movie I've reviewed on this channel, which is kind of hard to believe. The other one was Children of Sanchez, which is not a very good movie. Has a great soundtrack, though. Hall Bartlett also directed the movie Unchained. You might have heard of the theme from that movie. It's called Unchained Melody and was famously covered by the Righteous Brothers. Unchained, the movie, starred Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch, who was an NFL player, and he's also in Zero Hour, he plays the pilot. Of course, in Airplane, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar plays the co-pilot. In Zero Hour, the crew don't have any comedic names, sadly. No Clarence Over. Ted Stryker has the same name, and he's played by Dana Andrews. For 200 points, does anyone know why Dana Andrews might have been a particularly natural choice for playing this traumatized pilot with a spotty war record? It might be because of his role in the best years of our lives. If you're this far into this video and you haven't seen that movie, you've goofed, because that is a truly, truly great film. Dana Andrews would go on to be in a few other air disaster movies, including Airport 1975. Linda Darnell and Sterling Hayden are the other big players, and Jerry Paris from The Dick Van Dyke Show is also here, mainly as somewhat comedic relief. Obviously, this is a serious movie, but he gets a few jokes here and there. No dentistry, sadly. I kept finding myself surprised by how young Sterling Hayden looked in this movie. I think the timing of Zero Hour is a little bit deceptive, or it was to me, probably because part of my brain was thinking about Airplane and the 1980s, or 1980, I guess, is when that movie came out. For instance, at one point, I was thinking about how clearly Zero Hour was influenced by Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, a very famous episode of The Twilight Zone. Zero Hour has some themes of PTSD. It has a slightly existential and clinical feel, just like The Twilight Zone. Of course, the thing is that Nightmare at 20,000 Feet came out in 1963, well after this. At one point, I was thinking about how Zero Hour reminded me a bit of Airport, but of course that came out in 1970. So maybe my brain was getting a little bit confused by Airplane. While both these intuitions are totally wrong at first glance, there is actually something to both of them. First of all, Zero Hour originally was a teleplay. Maybe that's where it gets some of this Twilight Zone kind of thing. Not exactly. Obviously, the Twilight Zone didn't even start on the air until, I think, 1959. But maybe there's something about this sort of theatricality of this teleplay thing. It was written by Arthur Haley, who would later write a book called Airport that spawned the Airport franchise. Like I said, Airplane also borrows quite heavily from Airport. Zero Hour is clearly the main influence, though. To be honest, I don't know how famous Zero Hour was. It can be hard to gauge that kind of thing so many years later on. Obviously, it's not very widely known today. I don't know how influential it was at the time. Supposedly, the Zucker brothers and Jim Abrahams bought the rights to the entire movie, suggesting that it was probably not very influential. And if you were a copyright lawyer out there wondering how they got away with this, you can exhale. Although, obviously, it would probably be fair use anyway, I guess. Anyway, you'll notice a few pretty interesting things early on in Zero Hour. First of all, it opens up not with a shot of an airplane fin poking through the clouds as the Jaws soundtrack plays, but with fighter jets in wartime. Zero Hour, clearly a more serious movie, so it has a more serious beginning, but there's also something a bit patriotic about this, I guess. It's kind of interesting that Airplane actually doesn't spoof the wartime part of the story very much. There's a funny scene in the hospital, but they don't really focus on Ted Stryker's time in the military. In fact, it introduces this other narrative where Ted and Elaine join the Peace Corps almost to avoid that. That plot, this Peace Corps thing, that's not in Zero Hour whatsoever. Like I said, we open up with this military context, and maybe we also are clued in a little bit to ideas about aviation more generally, and modernity, technology, things like that. I'm not going to analyze this movie too deeply, but there's a few things that maybe will jump out at you. After the military scenes, we get a few scenes that are practically lifted directly from the best years of our lives. Ted trying to find a job, and Ted returning to his house. Zero Hour has domestic scenes in it. Well, it has domestic scene in it, really just one, but that's one more than Airplane, unless you count the brief moment where they go and try to fetch Rex Kramer from his house. That's, I guess, just the 1950s, the remnant of the 50s. And it might not seem that significant since there's only one scene, but it happens near the beginning. And in some ways, I think it actually does contextualize just about everything that's to come. In Airplane, Elaine is Ted's girlfriend, but in Zero Hour, Ted is married to Ellen. Ellen, not Elaine. They changed the name. I guess Ellen was too old-fashioned. They wanted a cool, hip, swinging name like Elaine. And they, like I said, they're married, and they in fact have a kid, too. A kid named Joey. Of course, in Airplane, there's a kid named Joey that goes up to the cockpit, but it's just some random kid. His parents are just happened to be on that flight. In Zero Hour, that's Ted's son. So there's this domestic angle in Zero Hour, and like I said, it's kind of par for the course of the 1950s. You might be getting the idea already, but when you start watching Zero Hour, it actually doesn't seem much like Airplane at all. In fact, I momentarily thought I might have put on the wrong movie. I heard this is a shot-for-shot, copy or whatever, but the beginning really is not that similar. Now, in addition to some differences, you'll also notice some things about this movie that are actually nice. The cinematography is pretty crisp, for instance. The footage of the planes looks great. I suspect that it was not actually shot for this movie, but hey, it looks good. Overall, things look good. The style is somewhat middle of the road, but there are a few cool shots here and there. Ted looking out the window, for instance. The style of the flashbacks is maybe a little bit cliched, but overall, solid. The cast is actually pretty good too. I've never been a big fan of Sterling Hayden, to be honest. Seems a bit wooden to me. I probably just made a mortal enemy, but oh well. Here, it's kind of the same. But otherwise, I think the cast is actually solid. There are definitely some clunky things in this movie, though. Some people talk about Zero Hour as inspiring Airplane because of how bad it is. That it had all these weird idiosyncrasies that were just so bizarre and strange and old-fashioned that they had to make a parody. I don't think this is particularly fair. This movie does not seem an order of magnitude stranger or hokier or clunkier than any sort of mid-budget 1950s movie out there. It does suffer from some issues, but they're very common Hollywood issues. For instance, I don't think the aviation of the aspects of the movie make that much sense. They actually devote quite a bit of time to the details of flying, so much that it makes the film drag a little bit. They talk about putting down the flaps, putting down the landing gear, all this stuff that they mainly skip over in Airplane. They spend a lot of time on this, but still, it doesn't really seem that legit. For instance, Sterling Hayden, Captain Treleaven, I think is his character's name, tells Ted Stryker not to let the airspeed of the plane drop below 120. Presumably, the plane would stall if this happens, I guess. Later, the plane accidentally goes into a dive. They lose control. It goes into a dive, and the airspeed drops below 120, but nothing really happens. There's no stall. They just kind of come out of, they figure out how to get out of the dive, and it's fine. I'm not a pilot, but to me it seemed like the plane would go faster. If it were in a dive, you would gain airspeed. Either way, it's pretty clunky filmmaking to set up this rule, hey, don't go below 120, and then like 10 minutes later, they do exactly that, and there's really no consequences. Of course, the premise overall is a little bit harebrained. This is no problem in Airplane, which is a comedy, but it's maybe a bit odd here. For instance, they say that they can't divert to another airport because there's fog everywhere. But when they get to Vancouver, that's where they're going in Zero Hour, it's foggy, and they land anyway. They say, well, we can't wait. We have passengers on board who can't wait. If you were going to fly through the fog anyway, why not do it sooner? I guess maybe they needed time to get psyched up for it. I don't know. Of course, another element that's played up in Zero Hour, another piece of the drama, is that they're landing in a city or near it, which is particularly sketchy because they worry about endangering the lives of people who live near the city. They worry about the plane missing the runway and crashing into houses. They talk about having to evacuate all these neighborhoods. And yet, they never consider diverting to another airport. Again, if they're going to come down in the fog anyway, surely they could pick an airport not near other people. That was an accident, me saying surely there, by the way. Another thing that is kind of clunky in Zero Hour, I don't know, I thought this was fairly telling, is the way they use the radio. Ted has his wife, Ellen, help him in the cockpit. This feels pretty contrived to begin with because Ellen starts out in the back of the plane as a passenger, tending to their son, Joey, who ate the fish and got sick. So they get a doctor to look over Joey, and then Ellen comes up to help. In Airplane, Elaine helps out, but she's one of the flight attendants, so it's much more natural. In Zero Hour, it feels like they kind of do a little bit of musical chairs to get everybody in the right position, to get Ellen up into the cockpit. There's only one stewardess, I guess, I think, in Zero Hour, and there's two pilots. So Airplane gives us three pilots and two stewardesses. Now, to start out with, Ted is working the radio. He gets in contact with people, and he talks to Captain Treleaven, but then he decides he really needs to focus on the steering wheel. He really needs to grip it with both hands and make his knuckles as white as possible. So he has Ellen take over the communication. But he then proceeds to basically just feed her every single line. He says, oh, this flies like a soggy piece of bread compared to the jets, or not the jets, compared to the planes that I flew. And then she says through the radio, well, he says it flies like a soggy piece of bread. It's very clunky. There's movies sometimes face these problems of radio things like this or translation. I mean, one thing that I was reminded of is the really, really great movie Judgment at Nuremberg, where they have the live translation going on. And it starts out with everybody speaking different languages, and everything is relayed through the translator. So you hear it going, you hear somebody speak in German, and then you hear the translator speaking through the headphones. But they do a pretty clever little switcheroo, a nice little mechanism, where they zoom in and then they suddenly switch to people all speaking English. I don't know, maybe it seems a little bit cheesy in some ways, but it's like, okay, we're not going to do this double thing for the entire movie, surely. They figure out a nice way to cope with that. In this movie, it's like, why are they repeating everything? It's quite clunky. I just got the impression that in the 1950s, in this 1950s movie, they really just struggled to give a woman any kind of real responsibility without it being extremely awkward. Like I said, there are some real 50s undercurrents in this movie, from the domesticity stuff at the beginning, some patriotic elements of it too, and also this part that are kind of telling. It's also worth noting, by the way, that in this movie, the military service, this movie's from 1957, so it's pretty obvious what war we're talking about here, World War II, and they are attacking the Germans. So there's a very real grounding and a real conflict. In Airplane, Ted Stryker is stationed in Drambuie, which is a type of alcohol, I believe, although they say that it's off the Barbary coast. And they attack, I forget where, their target is another type of alcohol, cognac or something like that. Clearly not as grounded to the conflict, although, like I said, Airplane doesn't exactly lambast military involvement. It basically lays off that. Anyway, there's one final difference at the end that I think, again, is pretty telling. Ellen and Ted seem to patch up their marital differences, which, like in Airplane, are mainly summed up by a fairly vague lack of respect. Ellen just can't respect Ted as long as he lives in the past or something like that, which is a somewhat antiquated attitude, I guess. They seem to get over this. Ellen, in the midst of seeing her husband bring this plane down, discovers that actually she does respect him. That's some practical advice for anybody who may be struggling in their relationship. If you're able to land a commercial aircraft on your own, could be a good way to reignite the fires. At the very end, after the plane has landed, this newfound mutual respect, the rekindled relationship, is sealed with a kiss, because of course it is. Actually, it isn't. Ted and Ellen don't kiss in 0 Hour at the end. They just look at each other. And perhaps there's some suggestion that things are looking up. I think there is. But there's no close affection to that. And I think that's also something that Airplane picks up on a little bit. Just how sort of unyielding the masculinity in 0 Hour is. Instead of giving Ellen a kiss, Ted is listening to the radio. He's listening to Captain Trevor-Levin, Sterling Hayden, who says, hey, I know we had some trouble in the past, but I want to buy you a drink. In Airplane, Ted and Elaine do kiss at the end, and we see a shot of the headphones hanging off the back of the chair as Rex Kramer spouts some random advice about being a good American, buying war bonds, something like that. He's lampooned for being opinionated in this way. This is a pretty interesting turnaround, I think. In 0 Hour, it seems almost more important that Sterling Hayden wants to get a drink with Ted, right? That he's been accepted back into the legion of men, that he's conquered his PTSD and is a man again. That seems more important than him patching things up with Ellen. Airplane, like I said, kind of latches onto this hyper-masculinity of the original. So look, I could go on with differences for a long time. I think there are some that are kind of interesting. Having said all that, don't get the idea that this is like a terrible movie. Like I said, I don't think this movie is any clunkier or hokier than the average mid-budget 1950s movie. I'm not sure if it's the first movie about a passenger trying to land a plane, but if it were one of the early ones, which I think it must be, you could see why people would go to watch this. It is actually a pretty interesting concept. Of course, now we've sort of become saturated with this idea. Could you land a plane and such is maybe not as compelling of a plot line as it would have been at one time. given all the time that's gone by and the fact that I've already seen Airplane about 25 times, it's a bit hard for me to judge how novel this movie is. It is interesting to compare Zero Hour to Airplane, although I don't think it's quite worth watching the movie just for that, unless you really like Airplane. I think some people watch this maybe more as a cult film, kind of to make fun of it, and to compare it to Airplane. I'm not really into that kind of thing. Like I said, this movie isn't really that clunky. The scenes that are similar are very similar, but most scenes are not that similar. There's a bunch of differences. Of course, the premise is the same. Anyway, the movie itself does have some virtues. I'm not sure if I'd recommend it if you've never seen Airplane, but it's a reasonably taut drama. The acting is okay, and it has some sort of 1950s mechanics and charms here and there, along with all of its weird 1950s foibles. Overall, I would say that Zero Hour is probably just tips the scale in terms of being worth watching.